All right. So let me show you a couple of interesting things here. Get that back this way. No. Yeah. We'll just assume it'll eventually come back. All right. So last time we oh, that's all this extra crap. That's the string manipulation stuff, right? Get rid of that junk. I always like to see people's reaction when I just delete like a wall of code. That's just gold. Okay, so last time we were talking about our dice roll object. We talked about public, private, protected. What's the difference between public and private? Private, uh, private object fields and methods are only accessible where? Go ahead. In the class in which they were created. Only inside that class. Public are accessible anywhere. Protected, we only have kind of a loose understanding of at this point because they're accessible in the class in which they were created or children of that class. And we haven't started making children yet. Making babies comes later. It's the birds and the bees. We're still learning how to walk at this point. What's up?
Thinking about it a bit early.
That's right. That's right. We're still early on in our relationship. We don't need to go. Okay. So, in any case, we talked about accessors and mutator methods last time, also known as getters and setters, right? And what are the purposes of getters and setters? Why do they exist? First of all, let me just re-throw out the caveat that there's nothing special about a getter or setter. They're normal methods. We just call them getters or setters. But why do they exist? What's the purpose of them? Go ahead.
So that you can control what you set it at, so you don't set it at some stupid number, or you just look at it only instead of without setting it.
Okay, well there's the here's the example we said first. So like set quantity allows us to make sure they don't try to set a quantity smaller than 1. So it gives us some control over it. Okay, I don't disagree with that. But why do they exist in the first place? Why do getters and setters need to exist in the first place? What do they do? If you had to concisely say what getters and setters' purpose for existence is, what would you say? Go ahead.
Allows you to kind of go around the security settings of a variable.
Okay. So give controlled access to private members. That sounded weird too. There was how many of you watch Big Bang Theory? There was a rerun on the other day. I watch that show every week, and we've seen all the episodes. But there was a rerun on the other week, and it was one of the episodes when Kuthapali and the comic book store guy were hanging out, and every single thing that came out of Kuthapali's mouth had some homosexual connotations, and he didn't mean it that way. But the comic book store guy was like, to an American ear, that doesn't sound right. Remember that episode? Who's your favorite character in that show? Really? Wallowitz.
I would agree.
See, I find that surprising. I don't dislike him, but he wouldn't be on my list of favorites. I like Sheldon or Koothrappali. Huh? Yeah, but that's for other reasons. Ay. Okay, so I'm going to quickly steal this code before I go and delete those two lines. So I want to show you a cool thing Eclipse can do. So we have 3 private fields associated with this object, right? Now, this random one, that's something we just use internally, correct? So we would never want to give access to that. But these other 2, num size and quantity, these are things we might want to give access to. Now, let's say that we want to provide read-only access to num size and quantity. That is, we want to let people external to this class be able to ask this object, ask an instance of this object, how many num sizes do you have? What's your number of sides? And what's your quantity? We don't want to let them set it. No, the only way you can set this is at the time that it was originally created. Okay? But we do want to give them access to it. So kind of a cool thing we can do is I'm going to right click just out here somewhere. And I'm going to go to source and then generate getters and setters. Click on that. It shows us all of our variables up here, all of the fields, which are variables, they're object level variables, global variables of this object. And I'm going to click on num size and quantity, but I'm going to expand these. And I don't want to let us set either of those. So I want to create a get num size and I want to create a get quantity. That make sense? Okay, and I'm going to have those be public, so all the default stuff is fine. Hit OK, and it just wrote those methods for me. Except it used curly braces on the wrong line. I hate that, but it doesn't matter. It still wrote them. That makes sense? So that could be beneficial. Not that beneficial here with 2 variables, but you can imagine when you start writing more complex objects, you might have 30 fields associated with an object. Being able to quickly write your setters and getters like that can be pretty helpful. Okay, so that's one of the power tool features of Eclipse, is they let you do that. Okay, so now we want to go and utilize our newfound talent in string parsing. What's string parsing again? Did we have a homework assignment where you took in a weird string with a bunch of white space in between words and had to pick out the words and create arrays with them, that kind of stuff? Okay, so parsing is pulling content out of a string in some sort of meaningful way, right? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a second constructor. So we have multiple ways of building a dice roll. Right now we have one way. We can build a dice roll by passing it a quantity and passing it a number of sides. We're going to create another way of creating a dice roll. Let's call this it's going to take in a string as a parameter, and we'll name this string roll syntax. Okay, and ultimately we want to be able to pass things in that look like 2d6 or 3d8. That kind of thing. That kind of thing, right? Okay. So, why? Well, because that's how cool kids refer to dice, right? That's what we say. We don't do this, well, the quantity is 5 and the number of sides is 7 or 6 or 8. We think of it as one fell swoop. So we'd like to be able to represent it that way. Now, outside of that, the advantage of that is if you were to see us create a dice roll dr3 is equal to a new dice roll 6d10, like that. To the casual observer, that might be meaningful if you know what dice rolls typically look like. Where looking up here, this looks a little bit more foreign. Does that make sense? So the cleaner we can make main, the more expressive we can make main, the more we can tell ourselves what this program is doing at a glance. All right, so, but in order to do this, we have to implement a second version of our constructor, one that takes in a string as a parameter and extracts the quantity and the number of sides. That make sense? So we need to go and write that guy. All right, so the quantity comes first, then number of sides comes second. So get quantity. How would I write this? So at the high level, how would you go about solving this problem? And here I'll give you a little, so the string might look like 3d8, for example, or 4d10, or 20d12. The reason I gave you three examples is the first one has a single digit before the D and after the D. The second one has a single digit before the D and a double digit after the D. And the other one has a double digit before and a double digit after. Okay, go ahead.
What about a double digit before and a single digit after?
You want me to throw another one in there? Or 20d4. Good? So how are we going to solve this problem? Generically, remember, we have to understand the problem first. Then we need to come up with our recipe for solving it. So do we understand the problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to extract, for example, out of this one, the 3 into a variable for quantity and the 8 into a variable for sides, num sides, where quantity and num sides are both integers. So I need to somehow get this 3 out of this string as an int and somehow get this 8 out of the string as an int. So if you're creating a recipe for somebody to do this, how would you approach this? Forget about the syntax for it at this point. Let's just think about the steps, the problem-solving steps to pull out the 3 and extract the 8. How would I get the 3 initially? Okay, well, you're probably going to use some charat to extract individual characters from a string, but you're going to have to do that in the context of something bigger. So charat is probably going to be a tool we're going to need. So if we're building a shed, we've got to go into the garage and get a bunch of our tools out. So we're probably going to need the strings charat method in order to accomplish this. What else? Whenever we're pulling things out of a string, do we probably need to traverse the entire string? So we probably need to walk the entire distance of the string and do something as we're walking, correct? So let's just start creating some rules here. 1, walk the entire string. And how do you walk a string? Well, s.length is the number of characters in a string. How do we do something over and over and over again? We create a loop. So we're probably going to walk the string using a loop. So we'll put a little note in there for us. Step number 2. So we're walking along the string. We're looking at bucket 0. We're looking at bucket 1. We're looking at bucket 2. We're looking at bucket 3, so on and so forth. What am I doing initially? What's the first stuff that I will start running into in my string? Assuming we have something that is proper roll syntax. You'd be running into numbers, right? And what does that number represent? Quantity. So in this case, we'd run into a 3. In this case, we'd run into a 4. In this case, we run into a 2, then a 0. In this case, we run into a 2, then a 0. And those numbers represent our quantity, correct? Okay. So we want to read in our quantity first. So let's call it capture the quantity. Maybe as a string. Because remember, Java is a string-based language. If we can get anything into a string format, we can. It's very pliable, malleable. I like that word, malleable. Okay, so capture the quantity as a string. What's the next thing we're going to run into? What do we want to do with the D? I just gave you an on-screen hint. So even Trista should get this right. How are we doing today? Good day, bad day?
Bad day.
Do you have an answer?
No.
What do I do when I run into a D? What do I do with this guy?
Remember it?
Remember it, what do I need it for?
The quantity? Wait.
You weren't paying attention, were you?
I was until you started typing.
Oh.
What do I do when I run into the D?
Well, I don't think you need to know that the D's even there, because that's gonna always be the case if you follow that format. But that's when you're stopping. That's when that quantity ends.
Okay. So ultimately, I want to skip the D, but the D lets me know that I'm getting ready, that the quantity just ended, and the next stuff up is going to be the number of sides, right? So skip the D, but know that the quantity has ended, and the num sides has begun. Step 4. So what do I do next? After I skip past the D,
That'll be num. This will be num size.
first thing I did was capture the quantity. After I skip the D, I know the quantity is done. I want to capture the number of sides as a string. Right? Okay. Step 5. So at this point, after steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, at this point I have the quantity and the number of sides extracted from my string, both stored as strings. What do I need to do with those?
Change the strings into
Get an int. So get the int version of quantity and number of sides. So we got to get the integer version of those two guys. Okay. Step 6. So I have two integers. What did I do before to create a dice roll? I didn't highlight it for my health.
Get a random number.
Give a value to our random number generator, and then set number of sides and our quantity. And we're done, right? Give value to random object. Set num sides and quantity fields to our extracted ints. Make sense? That's the recipe. In the end, we have a lasagna. It's a freaky way to make a lasagna. I wouldn't eat.
Throw a dice.
I wouldn't eat that. Okay. Do those still exist anymore? I remember when I was a kid, they used to have they look like pills, and you put them in the water and it pop out into like a little like spongy dinosaur looking guy. They still exist. Have you seen one of those? Maybe I'll get everybody one of those for Christmas presents.
Okay. What if it's a dinosaur?
I think it's all they sell is dinosaurs.
No, there's more than dinosaurs.
You think?
There's a lot of really weird ones.
My sister had some that were butterflies and flowers and stuff.
That's stupid.
I had a crocodile. Slightly less so.
Crocodile's kind of a dinosaur. It's basically the same thing. Kind of, sort of, same thing. Oh, speaking of the Transformers, he's wearing a Transformers t-shirt, by the way. There was a video, I don't remember who posted it, but there was a kid who had a Optimus Prime. It was on Facebook. I think I liked it. I think it was a Vines video. A kid had probably 7 years old, 8 years old, something like that. Had an Optimus Prime costume for Halloween that actually transformed. It was it was like a homemade costume. And, so he was in some sort of costume contest, and he literally just dropped to the ground, and he transformed into the semi.
Wow.
That was pretty legit. Man, if I had an Optimus Prime costume, I'd probably have to transform into a real semi. Because this kid was like a nice compact package. You just hit the ground, he just disappeared into nothing. The thing was like the size of a small wagon in the end. Man. 7, 8, I can't tell, youngish. Old enough to tell the guy with the microphone that he was Optimus Prime. And to stand on his own. He wasn't up on stage with his mommy or anything. He was up there. I'm guessing, so out of diapers? Was that 3? How old are you when you're out of diapers?
I'm sorry. I'm thinking of changing the 3-year-old's diapers.
Oh, so they're out of it before then?
Yeah, I would hope so.
Oh, because there was some sort of zone with my brother's kids where they just stopped wearing clothes.
I rarely wear clothes when I was a kid.
Well, so they start off where they're not in charge of their own clothes. So they wear whatever mom puts on them. And then they're running around in diapers. And then they just stop wearing clothes. I remember being at a Christmas gathering with all the family members and stuff like that. My brother's oldest kid was completely naked, running around with like 30 people in the house.
They like to do
Well, he was 17.
that. Oh, he wasn't.
I think he was like 3.
Oh, you 3, 17,
What was that? Was it some movie? It had the guy from King of Queens in it. The guy from that show. Yeah, and their son came up and wanted to breastfeed with them. Way too old. And his friends asked him, how old is he? And he gave the age in months. you know, like
Oh, I remember that.
like 118 months. You know, because that's like the rule, right? They can only do little kid things as long as their age is determined in months. That's like 7.
Almost 10.
Huh?
It's 10 almost.
Is it? No, it wasn't that much. It wasn't that high.
Okay.
It was like ridiculous, but not like impossible. Okay, so everybody understand our recipe here, our algorithm? So now we actually got to go and write this. So step 1, we have to walk the entire string. We got to create a loop. So start off at bucket 0 of our string. How many characters are in our string? Not S dot. Who dot? Who dot? Name of our string is called roll syntax. So we need roll syntax dot length. And each time through, we'll make I go 1 bigger than it used to be. Okay. Now, would you agree that steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 all belong inside of our loop? These are things that we're doing while we're looping through the string, correct? So we'll move those inside the loop. So, what's it complaining about here? Oh, I actually need to write a Boolean expression. There we go. I is less than roll syntax dot length. All right, so the first thing we're going to do inside this loop is we're going to start capturing our quantity. Well, how do we capture our quantity? We're going to capture it as a string. So how do I build up a string? I need to have a starting point. If I'm going to build a string, what's my base that I'm building off of? If I'm summing up some numbers, I start off at 0. If I'm multiplying some numbers, I probably start off at 1. If I'm building a string, I'm going to start off with what base value? Start off with the empty string. Something that is a string but has nothing in it. So before this loop, I'm going to create num sides string. Start them off as the empty string. I'm going to create quantity string. Start him off as the empty string. And I need to do this before the loop. Otherwise, if I do it inside the loop, every single time we spin back through the loop, I'll be resetting it to the empty string, destroying all the work they may have done at that point. Does that make sense? It's like having a beautiful painting and you're working on it, and you dip it in white paint at the end. Start again. Okay, so we need to do this before we start our loop because we want both of those guys to start off at the empty string. So, first thing is, we're going to start capturing our quantity. Now, how do we know that we're looking at quantity? So steps 2, 3, and 4 all kind of go together here, right? Under what circumstance do I know I'm capturing quantity? Before the D. I know that I'm capturing quantity if I have not run into a D yet. Correct? How do I know if I've run into a D yet? Maybe I should ask you this. How might I keep track of whether or not I've run into a D yet? Well, Boolean variable. I could ask a Boolean expression, but at some point I'm going to need to keep it somewhere, right?
Yeah, very well. Yeah.
So before this for loop, I'm going to create a Boolean. Let's see, let's make this grammatically correct. Have seen D. We'll start that off at false. So I have a variable called have seen D, and initially I have not seen a D, right? Therefore, I'm going to set it to false. And this happens before the loop starts. So that's just my base value. Now, what happens when I finally bump into a D? Well, then have seen D needs to turn into a false. How do I ask if the current character I'm looking at is equal to a D? Go ahead.
Char at.
Who's char at?
Roll syntax at char at I.
Roll syntax dot char at I. What do you want me to say here?
That you're gonna need to put it into a
Okay.
that.
So if this,
Yeah. If that's equivalent to the char.
equivalent to the double equal sign. So if that's equivalent to, how do I write char D?
One. Yeah.
That guy? And let's even be extra awesome here. And we'll put an or statement in. And we will allow our users to pass in a lowercase d as well. That make sense? Are you ready for the pop quiz? Let's say I want you to support upper and lowercase d's, but you're not allowed to use an or. Go ahead.
If you would ask if it came into a lowercase d, change it to an uppercase d before that.
Okay. How?
By the character dot to uppercase.
Okay. So we're going to, this guy right here is a char, right? And we have a special factory called character that we can pass chars to, and it will convert those chars into uppercase or lowercase, whatever we tell them to do. So why don't we always pass that char into two uppercase. So if it is lowercase, we'll just convert it to uppercase real quick. So now this says if we are looking at some sort of D, either an upper or lowercase d, because no matter what we're looking at, we're converting it to uppercase. That makes sense? So if we're looking at a D, then what do I want to do? I just bumped into a D. We need to set our have seen D variable to true. Right? Now, if I didn't bump into a D, what must I be looking at? If I'm still inside this loop. If I'm still inside this loop, that means I have a character to look at, right? If I didn't bump into a D, so this first thing says if you looked at a D, do what? Set have seen D to true. But if I didn't bump into a D, what must I have bumped into? A number. So now I need to decide which container does that number belong to. It either belongs to num side string or quantity string. So how do I ask the next question? How do I ask if something belongs to quantity string? How do we know we're building our quantity? Under what circumstances are we building our quantity?
We haven't hit D yet.
Okay, if we haven't run into a D yet. And how do we ask the question, have we not run into a D yet? Is it true that we have not seen a D? How do we ask that question? Good.
We ask if have seen D is equal to false.
Okay, so else, if have seen D is equal to false, that means we are in the process of building up our quantity, right? So we'll say quantity string is equal to quantity string concatenated with roll syntax dot char at I. Make sense? Else, if I'm not looking at a D and I'm not working on the quantity, I must be working on what? I must be working on num sides. So we'll say num sides is equal to, it's actually num side string, is equal to num side string concatenated with roll syntax dot char at I. So this first if statement says, am I looking at a D? This guy says, have I seen a D yet? No. Build quantity string. Okay, so am I looking at a D? Yes. Switch my Boolean variable to true. Actually, let's write it more English-like. Mark that I have seen a D. That's what this first if statement says. It asks, am I currently looking at a D? If I have, mark that I have seen a D. Now, if this statement is false, then I'm going to come down to this else. I'm going to ask else if I've already seen a D. Have I seen a D yet? No. So we're going to build quantity string. That's what we do. That's what we're doing right here. We're setting quantity string equal to whatever it currently is, concatenated with the current character that we're looking at. Else, so if this is false and this is false, then we're left off here. I must have seen a D, so let's build num sides. Num side string. That makes sense? So this is step 3. This is step 2. This is step 4 as it matches up. We just have them out of order because the only thing that's not a number is D. So we say, am I looking at a D? If I am, skip it, but keep in mind what I was just working on. Else, I must be looking at a number. Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move number 5 outside of the loop. When this loop is done, what does num sides string and quantity string equal? What do those guys hold? After this loop is all said and done. They hold strings representing what? The strings representing the quantity that I extracted from my input string and the number of sides I extracted from my input string. Now I need to get them in integer versions, right? How do I get the integer version of a string? Have I shown you an easy way of doing that yet? Well, if I didn't, then we're going to have to write it. It just makes this class that much more fun. Because then in the end, I'm going to show you like a super easy way to do all this, which is going to be so funny. Okay, so is that a no? We don't know how to get easy integers? Oh, gonna have to write a method. Whew, man, this is gonna suck. So before we can finish writing this guy, we have to write a method. We'll make it private so nobody else has access to it. This guy's gonna return an int, and we're gonna call this guy will be called string to int. It's gonna take a string as a parameter. So for example, if it took in a string that looks like 123, it should boil down to the integer 123. Or the string 5 should boil down to the int 5. That make sense? All right. Well, how am I going to do that? Using only what you know how to do now. Man, this would be a good homework assignment, this part. If I gave you the string 123, how do you translate that into the number 123? One, two, three is what? It is 3 ones plus 2 tens plus 1 100s, which is the number 123. We're back to like, this is either first or second grade math, right? That was so long ago. That's back when I was a mathematician. So how do I get the 3 and multiply it by 1, and then add to that the 2 multiplied by 10, and add to that the 1 multiplied by 100? This is the ones place. This is the tens place. This is a hundreds place. So I'm multiplying it by 10 each time, right? Am I walking my string from the end towards the beginning? All right, so we have to write our steps. 1, walk. Oh, that was pretty messed up. Walk string backwards. Loop. Two, start with the ones place. And do what? Multiply it by the number version of the character. Okay, let's say at the char at. Now the char I am looking at. I'm going to actually kick this down the line. All right, so that's step 2. Multiply the place by 10 as each time I move closer to the front of the string. Let's see, start with the ones place and multiply it by the number version of the char I'm looking at and add it to my running total. Then multiply by 10 as I move closer to the front of the string. After I run out of chars, return the sum. Make sense? So, I'm going to walk the string backwards. That's going to be a loop. I'll even give you that loop. For int I is equal to s dot length minus 1. That's the last legal bucket in our string. Keep going as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, and subtract 1 from I each time. That's what I want to do inside there. Everybody take out a piece of paper. Notice I've only asked you to fill in a few of the blanks here. I've given you a bunch of this code. I'm actually going to give you one additional method. I'm going to be nice here. Just so you don't have to type as much, or write as much. That's 0, that's 1, that's 1, that's 2, that's 2, that's 3. Now, even calling this method is part of the test, though. So you're going to have to show me that you understand how to call a method. Okay. So, finish writing string to int here. Basically, I just need you to write the rewrite this for loop. So start your homework or start your quiz with that line right there, and finish it with that line right there. But fill in the blanks in the middle. And notice I've given you a method up here, and I'm telling you that method works. What does that method do? It takes a char as a parameter. For instance, if I passed it the char 7, as an example, 7 turns into the int 7. Or 9 turns into the int 9, so on and so forth. All right, so I've given you a tool for converting a single char-based digit into its equivalent number. So I want you to basically execute steps 2 and 3 here. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. one more minute. All right. So, let's pass them this way. Make sure you got your name on them. So, let's write this guy. Place started off at the ones place. We're going to say sum is equal to sum plus. Now we need to multiply our place times whatever's returned from our string to int method. Actually, I'm sorry, char to int method up here, the one I wrote for you. So, first of all, is this a class method or instance method? Go ahead.
Class
Okay, tell me why you're wrong.
oh wait.
It's an instance method. You only had two choices. Yeah, so why is it an instance method? Tell me why you're right.
Because it doesn't have
No static. This is the method definition. We don't see static out front. How do we call instance methods? Using an instance of the class in which the method was defined. What class was this method defined in? Dice roll. So I need an instance of dice roll to call this guy. So I want to take whatever my sum currently is and add to it whatever my place is times the integer version of the next char. So the next char I'm looking at is s dot char at I, but I need the integer version of this char. And how do I get the integer version of a char? I call my char to int method that's written up here. And how do I call that method? In order to call this method, you need an instance of the dice roll class. Do I have an instance of the dice roll class? I'll give you a hint. The answer is yes. What's that instance of the dice roll class called? I stumped you on this one too?
You did. I was really confused.
Seems like I already stumped Abe. He didn't even know what kind of he was so flustered. Anybody know what the instance of my, go ahead.
DR?
DR?
Isn't that, well, I mean,
That's in driver. That's over here.
dice roll.
Yeah, but that's in driver. I'm inside dice roll. I'm right here. I need access to an instance of dice roll right here. Nobody got this? Go ahead. This. The this keyword is this instance of this class. So right here I can say this. Let me actually just steal. Let me just cut this and I'll put it back in a second. I can say this dot char to int, passing it the character I want to convert to an int. That make sense? So there's a real-time example of when you need to have access to yourself, to be able to refer to yourself. So I needed to call an instance method here, and I needed to call it with an instance of the class in which it was defined, so I put this dot out front. Now, pretend like you don't see what I'm about to show you next. You technically could have done that. If you are inside of a class, if you are calling a method from within the context of an instance, it will automatically be as if you put the this dot in front of it. But now what I'm telling you is never do that. Always be explicit. When you get to the point where you know that it's cool that you can leave that off, then you can start leaving it off. But it's not a reasonable reason to do it just because it works. Does that make sense? So two very different things. So once you understand why it works, then you can start leaving it off. But for now, how do we call an instance method of a class? When you're inside of that class, you refer to the instance of that class, which is this. All right, so I'm going to use this instance to call his instance method char to int. And I'm going to pass it s.char at I. So pass it the current character I'm looking at, which should be a number. And so ultimately, this guy will boil down to a number. And what am I going to do with that number? I'm going to multiply it by the current place. First time through, this will be the ones place. Next time through, I hope it's the tens place. I haven't written that code yet, but that's what it should be. And add that onto my sum. After I do that, I'll say place is equal to place times 10. And that takes care of steps 2 and 3. Make sense? Now, just to test this real quick, I'm going to make this method public. That way we can come out to our driver. And I can say, let me get rid of some of these lines here. System.out.println dr.string to int 123. And just to prove that it's working, I'll add 5 to that. So we should get 123 to the screen, then we should get 128 to the screen. Proving that we're doing math with it. If I wasn't doing math with it, I would have gotten 1, 2, 3, 5 to the screen. It would have been concatenation. Okay, so that makes sense? All right, go back over to dice roll here. Now, let me ask you this. How many of these char to int methods need to exist? Isn't that kind of a one-off type thing? Does each one of my dice rolls need to know how to convert a char to an int? Or is that more of a global thing that only needs to exist once? That's a global little utility we're using, right? So here's an example when we might choose to define a method as being a class method. So I'm going to put static out in front of that guy. Same exact method we had before, but now it's a class method because I only need him to exist once. I just need this ability so that I can throw a char to him and he'll give me back the integer version. But now that it's a class method, I no longer call it with this. How do I call class methods? Using the name of the class in which the method was defined. What's the name of the class in which this method was defined? Dice roll dot. That make sense? So there's an example of when you might choose to write something as a class method versus an instance method. I don't need every single instance that I ever create of dice roll to have its own version of char to int. Or its own version of string to int, for that matter. I just need it to exist. That make sense? So I'm actually going to make this guy a class method as well. They're just utilities I'm going to use. So I'm going to build them into this object, but I don't need an instance of the object to call it. I just need the name of the object. Okay. So now we have our string to int working, and we have our char to int working. So what we'll do is when we come back next time, let me actually just collapse both of these real quick. We're up here in our constructor. We're going to have to get the int version of quantity and number of sides. Well, now we have the ability to do that, don't we? We have a method we just wrote that does it. So I'm going to turn that method back to private, and then we'll finish off that constructor next time, and then I'll show you the way easier way of doing it in just like a couple of lines of code. All right, I will see everybody on Thursday.